Hey listeners, thanks for dropping in. I'm Christy.
And I'm Melissa. And this is Buried Motives, where we dig deep into the details of some of the most gruesome
dirtbag murderers. Hey listeners.
Welcome back to Buried Motives.
Thank you for choosing to join us today.
We're excited that you're here because we have our last listener request. You guys delivered.
100% you did.
And the last case that we're going to cover today came to us from a few people. Thank you, Deanna, Matt, and Donna for requesting this one. They requested that we dig deep into the mass casualty that happened in Nova Scotia in 2020 when 22 lives were lost.
This was a real tragedy for Canada. But I have to admit, I don't know all of the details, so I am very intrigued on what Melissa's going to bring us. I know she's been working away so hard on this case. It's going to be a doozy and it's going to be a long one.
It will be a long one. The effects of a mass casualty are hard to quantify. We have often spoken about how many people are affected by one dirtbag's actions. But with a mass casualty, the ripples extend farther than you can imagine. And it's definitely true when it comes to today's case. It was honestly hard to wrap my head around how this affected the people of Nova Scotia and beyond. People in small towns everywhere were looking at their neighbors differently, and the usual sense of safety that's associated with rural communities was shaken. It wasn't an outsider that had come in and caused destruction. It was one of their own. One of the most commonly expressed emotions in the aftermath was that nowhere felt safe anymore.
Oh, what a terrible feeling that would be.
It would be. Coming from a small rural community, I totally get that feeling of feeling safe. That stuff only happens in the big city. But that just wasn't the case.
No, it's true. We both come from small towns and we feel fairly safe walking our dogs at night, that we're not going to get jumped or harmed.
No. And there's a general sense of community in small towns where you look out for one another.
Absolutely.
And that would play a large part in today's case. The majority of the information that I'm going to talk to you about today comes from a very extensive document that was published by the government of Nova Scotia, following a very intense inquest into the tragedy. There were a lot of questions to be answered about how this dirtbag was able to murder 22 people in less than 13 hours. The truth I found was shocking. During the inquest, there was a deep dig done onto what kinds of people become the type of dirtbags that snap and kill a lot of people. Of the things that were discovered, 3 things really stood out. The inquest identified that the individuals usually experienced trauma in their early childhood, and that they had reached a crisis point in their life at the time of the incident, and were showing signs of that cracking to people that knew them, and that they had the means to carry out their despicable plans. All 3 were true of the dirtbag Gabriel Wortman. I'm going to call him Gabe. I'm not sure if that's what he liked to be called, but actually I could care less what he wanted to be called.
Dirtbags don't get to decide
That's right.
What we call them.
So I'm going to go with Gabe. He was born on July 5th, 1968, to a long line of abusers. His parents, Evelyn and Paul Wortman, raised him as an only child just outside of Moncton, New Brunswick, the maritime province that is adjacent to Nova Scotia. The couple did have one other son, Jeff, 2 years after Gabe. He was born in the U.S. and was given up for adoption.
Really?
Yeah. Gabe would only learn that he had a brother in 2010. It was a shocking discovery that widened an already sizable rift between him and his parents.
That is wild.
Yeah, they kept one son and gave the other son up for adoption.
Especially for it to happen in an atypical order. You could see that they get pregnant first, place that baby for adoption, and then later, when they're a little more mature, get pregnant a second time and decide to keep that child.
Right. It's a speculation. I'm not really sure if this is accurate, but I think that they recognize that they just didn't have a good environment to bring a child up in. Because it seems Jeff got the better end of the deal.
Oh, man. Or was it the milkman baby? And her husband was like, you better get rid of this one if you want to stay together.
Maybe. It seemed like he was a full brother.
Okay. That just was surprising.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was better off for him, then that was the right choice to make.
Oh, it definitely was, because Paul was an abusive father, a trait he had learned from his father, who had learned it from his father.
Was his mom abusive too?
No, she was severely abused.
So maybe it was her way of saving that child.
Mm-hmm. I really mean that Jeff got the better end of the deal. The abuse Paul received as a child morphed into hostility towards others. In turn, he would become abusive towards his father, and he wasn't the only one. One of his brothers, Glenn, tried to stab their father to death and was jailed because of it.
Oh, wow.
There was a lot of hatred in this family.
Very volatile, it sounds.
Mm-hmm. Gabe, in his later years, would beat his father unconscious while on a family trip to Cuba in 2010, just continuing this cycle of abuse.
Wow. It doesn't sound like a very loving environment.
No, it most definitely was not. And abuse wouldn't be the only trait that Paul passed on to Gabe. At a young age, Paul ran away from home and became involved in petty theft and alcohol. He would eventually return to his hometown near Moncton, but the time away hadn't turned into forgiveness, and it definitely hadn't cooled his temper. Marriage and parenthood only made things worse. Paul abused both his wife and son, just like he had been abused. Although he claimed later that he only yelled a lot, others would say that they had seen Paul slap, kick, and choke Evelyn. He would even point guns at Evelyn and Gabe and threaten their lives if they didn't comply.
Oh.
Gabe would tell people that his father never treated him like a little boy. He treated him instead like an animal. When he was 3, his father determined that he was too old for a security blanket, so he burned his favorite item right in front of him. By the time he was 6, his parents would take him to the mall and purposely leave him there to find his own way home along the highway.
What?
Mm-hmm.
To quote-unquote toughen him up?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what their plan was with this. But they would just take him to the mall and say, okay, you can find your own way home. When Gabe was not much older, many people recount that Paul had made him kill his own dog.
What?
Yeah, Paul just felt like Gabe wasn't taking care of it well enough, or Paul just didn't want to take care of it at all. So he had Gabe kill the dog.
That is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
This is a lot of trauma for a tiny little human being.
It is. And it's a trauma that would live into his adulthood and still be evident. Gabe would give animals, especially dogs, the affection, respect, and treatment he wouldn't afford the people in his life.
Well, it seems like his father was just stripping him of all security. No security items. We're going to drop you in the middle of nowhere and expect you to get home. We're going to take away your dog.
Yeah, maybe it was a way to toughen him up.
Yeah, a really dumb way. That's not going to toughen him up. That's going to screw him up.
Yeah. Paul was described by his relatives as a career criminal that was skilled at manipulating the system to tip the financial scales in his direction. He would pass that skill along with the abusive nature on to Gabe. Gabe learned at a very early age that money meant power almost as much as physical abuse did. He also learned that if you had to commit some crimes to obtain some money or power, it wasn't so bad. It was getting caught that was the problem. That was one of his dad's main mottos.
That's unreal.
Yeah. After high school, Gabe went on to study at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. According to his uncle Glenn, Gabe paid for his education by smuggling cigarettes from the States using a friend's boat. Once he got them across the border, he would sell them and make a profit, usually selling them to students. He didn't care that what he was doing was wrong, and he didn't really care if anybody got hurt, as long as he got what he wanted. And this would be a constant attitude in his life. The amount of times that he would hurt someone to get what he wanted was awful. The friend, whose boat it was an older man with a similar attitude, Tom Evans. The two had met when Gabe had rented an apartment from Tom. Tom was a lawyer from Fredericton, and the two of them became very close. Gabe looked up to him as a father figure, and he became somewhat of a mentor for this impressionable boy who was motivated to make it big. Tom was one of the only people that could keep Gabe's temper in check. Gabe always seemed to be eager to please him, which I thought kind of made sense because he viewed him as a father figure. He wanted to impress him. He wanted to make him happy. The two men got along very well. They were like peas in a pod. Unfortunately, Tom was not the most upstanding man, if you hadn't guessed it from the smuggling activity and hanging out on university campuses with men almost 30 years younger.
Yeah, it didn't sound like it. He's a lawyer? A shady one.
Yes, very shady. In 1986, Tom complained that a 19-year-old male sex worker had assaulted him. That young man was acquitted. And the following year, Tom was convicted of providing liquor to teenage boys and sexually assaulting them.
Ooh, what a creep.
Mm-hmm. There were a string of criminal and liquor control convictions that followed. And under the threat of being disbarred, Tom did eventually resign from being a lawyer.
Good.
Tom and Gabe would continue their friendship long after Gabe left university and was no longer renting from him. Eventually, Tom would start, quote, renting from Gabe. Their dealings were not always on the up and up. Tom was the kind of guy that associated with drug cartels and very high rollers.
How did this guy become a lawyer?
I think you'd be surprised at how many lawyers have connections like that.
True. I think that's probably true in every profession.
Yeah. There was a contractor that worked for Gabe later on that would claim that he was almost certain that Tom and Gabe were dealing cocaine in some pretty high volumes.
Oh.
So there was rumors that these two had a partnership going on.
That's a big step up from cigarettes.
Mm-hmm. But they had started out with cigarettes and it seemed like it evolved.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Yeah, it does to me. There was no definitive proof that Tom was caught up in drugs or that he caught Gabe up into the same business. But it is very suspicious given Gabe's future finances. Either way, the two were obviously close. When Tom died in November of 2009, he left everything to Gabe, over $300,000 from his estate. He would also leave him a rifle that Gabe would never obtain a possession or acquisition license for. University was also the place where Gabe met his first wife. Her name was redacted from all of the reports, and that happened a lot with a lot of the different people in the inquest. The two got married in 1992, just as Gabe was finishing up his psychology degree. He then studied business and received his diploma as his wife finished up her degree. When deciding what to do next, he thought long and hard about which career would make him a lot of money. That was his motivating factor. He had worked for a short time at a youth group home, but when it was obviously not going to bring in a whole lot of cash, he took courses to become a funeral director before moving on to become a dead tourist. It was that course and the work at the funeral home that brought him to Nova Scotia. He spent 2 years as a funeral director before he chose to become a denturist.
Oh, I wasn't expecting that from psychology and business. But a great smile was important to him.
Yeah, that's what was important to him, for sure. This career appeared on the outside to be very lucrative for him. Soon he was purchasing other offices to expand his practice. The couple eventually settled in Dartmouth and bought a building on Portland Street that would become their home and the main denture clinic. The couple's marriage ended after 10 years when Gabe was caught cheating with a student.
Who?
I'm not sure if this affair was the next significant other in Gabe's life, Lisa Banfield, but the timelines are suggestive of that. But maybe there were other women in between there as well. That is certainly the case in the future. Lisa and Gabe met in May of 2001 at the Thirsty Duck in Halifax. And before long, she found herself quitting her job at the bank and working at Gabe's Atlantic Denture Clinic. Within 3 months, she moved in with Gabe into an apartment above the clinic. It was such a whirlwind romance that it would take digging into journals to find out the actual date they met. It all happened in such a blur that for 19 years, they celebrated their anniversary on April 19th because they couldn't remember the exact date. And they figured that any day was as good as any other. And so they just chose a date.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Sadly, that date would later be remembered for much more tragic things. Lisa said that when she met Gabe, he was charming and very sweet. She was vulnerable and got swept up with Gabe's convertible and the 24 long-stem roses he offered. She said the cincher for her had been when, on their first date, they had been rear-ended by a woman driving a van. Lisa thought Gabe was showing her who he really was when he got out of his damaged vehicle and told the woman, "It's okay."
Oh, you would think that this was a test of his character.
Right, because it was an unplanned event.
Right.
How wrong Lisa would be. It wasn't the real Gabe at all. About a year into the relationship, Gabe asked Lisa to sign a document that pretty much said she wasn't entitled to anything of his. She thought this was odd, but she was okay signing it. Not a lot of people can envision the end when the beginning of a relationship is so sweet. And she's like, "Oh, it doesn't matter anyway, I'll sign this." And he was just concerned that another woman would be able to take part of his wealth because he had been divorced once.
Right, he'd learned the first time.
Mm-hmm. And he was not going to let that happen again. About 2.5 years in, things began to change. He gradually took away her independence, convincing her that he would take care of her. So it's okay if you give up your vehicle and you can just use one of mine. And why would you keep another job when you can just work here at the clinic?
So she becomes totally dependent on him.
She did. He also became possessive and treated her like she was his property. He would even grope her in public to stake his claim.
Ooh.
Yeah, it sounded really nasty.
That is nasty. Guys, women don't like that.
No. But it sounded like he would do it on purpose to make sure everybody knew that she was his.
even if it made her feel uncomfortable.
Oh yeah, it was all about him. By 2005, Lisa had learned the denture business. She had given up her career at the bank and was working now full-time at the clinic, even though things in the relationship were starting to turn a little sour. She felt like she was committed now. She had already left everything else behind. She had no other income, and because of the document that she signed, she wasn't entitled to anything. So she stayed and endured abuse. For 19 years, Lisa would say that Gabe was a controlling, abusive psychopath who repeatedly beat her.
That's terrible.
That's a long time to put up with abuse. And not that it would ever make up for the abuse, but there were some perks to being with Gabe. By 2020, he had amassed quite the financial portfolio. He owned 6 properties and was sole shareholder in 3 corporations.
Ooh, so he was living large.
He was. The couple had 2 homes, the home in Dartmouth with a clinic, and their second home, or cottage, which really wasn't a cottage, was in Portapique. The cottage was a 2-story log and stone home with an attached double-car garage and a poured concrete semicircular driveway. It had an intricate stone-covered walkway that led to the front door, and the grounds were immaculately maintained. At the back of the cottage, a large stone deck gave way to an extensive wooden deck that overlooked the ocean.
Oh, so this is like a mansion.
Oh, it's like a little resort. Status was important to Gabe. It allowed him to be the eccentric rich guy, which unfortunately gave him a position of power and privilege over others. No one was going to stand up to him because they feared either his violence or the influence that he could control with his money.
And was he pretty charismatic to do that well in his business dealings?
I wouldn't say he was charismatic because he was easily offended and he had a really quick temper. I think it was more that he was coercive than charismatic.
Okay, he could manipulate.
Mm-hmm. And he would purposely flaunt his money.
So people would view him as powerful.
Yes. There have been some that have suggested that Gabe was an injustice collector. An injustice collector is someone who views themselves as the victim and tallies up all the wrongs ever done to them.
So he was keeping score.
Yes, always keeping score. He sounded like he was one of those guys whose good side you wanted to stay on, because if you were on his bad side, then he could be really vindictive or outright abusive. This kind of mentality just gave him a sense of even more power.
Because nobody would be challenging him.
No, nobody did. Either he would fly off the handle and start hitting and punching, or he would become vindictive and use his money and influence against you.
Ooh, he sounds very dangerous already.
He does sound dangerous. And his money allowed him to be dangerous. The couple lived a lifestyle unencumbered by budgets. They pretty much bought whatever they wanted, from Mercedes to household items. They had it all. An audit of their spending habits would show that Lisa spent over $20,000 just at Winners from December 2017 to May 2020.
Oh, just at Winners?
Just at Winners.
What is that life? I can only imagine.
I don't know, but I thought I want to be on her Christmas list because I love Winners.
Right? Well, just the freedom to just buy whatever you want.
Yeah. From a review of their spending habits, the income she claimed on her income tax was just over $56,000 for pretty much the same time period. So definitely, income did not match their spending habits.
They were fixing the books a little.
Yeah. Gabe and Lisa also frequently traveled to Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic. So often that Lisa would say that they got friendly with management at the resorts, and oftentimes they would just leave their suitcases and belongings at the hotel because they would be back again so soon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for several years, it seemed like they traveled there almost every couple of weeks. Lisa said she would spend days at the beach, and Gabe would travel into the towns and the cities. He said that it was because he was just always too bored to stay at the resort. The money allowed them to live a very nice lifestyle. Questions were raised after his death about where all this money had come from. While denturists make good money, it didn't exactly add up to the sums that Lisa and Gabe were spending on a continual basis. The math just didn't math. Through a financial audit done after the fact, it was found that Gabe frequently moved large sums of money between multiple banks, passing them back and forth through his business and personal accounts. While forensic accountants could trace the movement of the funds, they could not track the original sources for the initial deposits. They were all done in cash. In August of 2010 alone, Gabe made 2 deposits, one for $70,000 in cash and the other for $130,000 in cash.
That's more than most people's yearly incomes.
Yeah. These funds did not match at all the reported income tax of $200,000 that Gabe had reported on his taxes for the 4 years between 2015 and 2019.
Wow. Yeah, that's just in 1 month.
Yeah.
Yeah, something shady's going on.
Absolutely. Through online record tracking, the accountants would prove that from December of 2017 to April of 2020, that Gabe spent 87% of his reported income in just 2 places, on PayPal and the CG Surplus.
Oh.
So obviously he was not being honest about his bookkeeping and his taxes. Because you can't spend 87% of your income in 2 places and still be able to live the way he's living.
It's true. Even
Right?
just all your insurances and utilities and gasoline and food. Yeah, there's no way.
That's right.
Let alone your vacations.
Mm-hmm. Something fishy was definitely going on. There was a preliminary financial investigation done when one of the banking institutions flagged Gabe's accounts because there was, quote, reasonable grounds to suspect that the transaction or attempted transaction is related to the commission of a money laundering offense or terrorist activity. But the investigator claimed that the transaction didn't meet the definition of terrorist activity, so nothing ever came of it.
Wow.
But his accounts were being flagged. After the fact, Gabe's finances were dug into so thoroughly because they contributed to Gabe's personality and his mental state in April of 2020. His possible involvement with organized crime would explain how he could pull off what he did, and his vast wealth and access to so much cash was the reason he was able to secure as many illegal guns as he did and bankroll the other things that he would use. After his crime spree, when Gabe's finances did make headlines, there was even gossip that he might have even been a police informant and that they had given him loads of cash. This was adamantly denied.
Yeah.
But it was pretty clear that he was being shady with his money dealings.
Oh, 100%. There had to have been some criminal activity going on.
Yeah. Lisa would deny that she ever saw any signs of money laundering, drug involvement, or informant activity. She just figured Gabe was making good money. After all, dentures aren't cheap.
And he had multiple offices.
Yeah, that he worked at very few days a week. He rented them out to another person. He had quite the organization going on. To support the drug idea, though, police did find after his death a Via Rail boarding pass that had been written on by Gabe. It appeared to be a cannabis price list, with references to various strands of cannabis and prices.
Hey, that makes more sense.
Yeah. For me, the drug dealing and even the money laundering seemed to be on par for this dirtbag. He was a guy that was all about doing whatever he liked, and what he liked was money and power.
And he had already had experience in selling drugs.
And smuggling things across the border.
Yes.
He was all about getting what he wanted, and he didn't care who got hurt in the process. Strangers, friends, family, it didn't matter to him. In his adult years, his relationship remained very strained with his parents, especially after he beat his father in 2010. Him refusing to call his parents mom and dad wasn't the end of his animosity towards his family. In that same year, a bitter property battle began amongst his uncles and himself. It was beyond bitter, with Gabe uttering threats to kill his parents, and he even began shooting up his own home in his rage. These 2 incidences weren't pursued because it was kind of chalked up to just Gabe being Gabe.
Oh.
When he was drunk, his temper would flare up. During the one incident, Lisa admitted that she was afraid that he could hurt the police if they came to their door, and so she was afraid to call them. Even though she was terrified, she was worried they were going to get hurt.
Wow, that says a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Not that, oh, my husband might get hurt in a shootout. No, she fully believed he would be the one hurting them.
Yes.
That speaks to just how dangerous he was.
Mm-hmm. He was volatile.
Ugh.
Over this same property dispute, at another time, he drove his truck through the fence that surrounded his uncle's house, taking out the post one by one by one. His other uncle was terrified that he might try to burn down the disputed property because it was something that Gabe had done when he was a child. He liked to set things on fire and blow them up.
He has so many of the signs.
Uh-huh. This property dispute over 135 Orchard Beach Drive in Portapique was taken all the way to the Supreme Court before it was determined that Gabe was trying to swindle his family out of their property.
Wait,
Mm-hmm.
What a waste of the Supreme Court's time.
He had done some shady dealing about switching names on deeds. He agreed to take a loan out, and then when the loan was paid back, He had already switched his name on the deed.
Wow. And just so selfish. He already has this abundance of money. He could wipe his bottom with money if he really wanted to. And then he's going to fight his family who's not well off for a piece of property.
Yeah, it was all about the power.
Yeah, sounds like it.
As you can imagine, after that dispute, there wasn't much of a relationship left with his family.
No, because even the cost to go all the way to the Supreme Court, they probably weren't even ahead after the sale of that property.
No. After 2016, he didn't even see his parents again. And if you can imagine, if he could do that to his own family, it's not a big surprise that he would pull the same kind of maneuvers on other people. There was another person, Stephen Zink, who would claim that Gabe also tried to swindle him out of his property. Gabe agreed to provide a loan for him so he wouldn't lose his house when he had fallen on hard times. Then Gabe foreclosed on the loan and became the owner of the property himself.
Dirty.
During his denture business, he exploited his lower income clients and committed numerous acts of billing fraud. He charged the insurance companies the highest rates possible, more than he charged the clients. He also conspired to exploit immigrant programs that would provide him with revenue and low-cost employees at the same time.
Oh, what a dirtbag. He's a menace.
He's just all out for himself. Whatever saves him a buck, he's willing to exploit. Gabe also used his denture clinic to abuse female patients.
No.
Yeah. Gabe admitted to professional misconduct over that and some other issues in 2007. He was suspended for 1 month and made to pay an $8,000 fine.
What?
Yeah.
Suspended for a month and then he could just resume. And I'm assuming he was sexually assaulting them?
That's what the claims were. But it wasn't just the fine, Christy. He also had to attend 2 counseling sessions at a psychology clinic and a seminar called Dealing with Difficult People, How to Communicate with Tact and Skill.
Whoop-de-doo!
Yes. He had only gotten a slap on the wrist because he convinced the professional board that the allegations brought against him were a misrepresentation or that they had been blown out of proportion because the women accusing him were older or crazy. He was using the women's ages and their low income status against them.
Oh.
He made it sound like he was the victim and that he was just merely acting with generosity and assisting those with limited means to pay his services.
Oh, that's disgusting.
It is.
But we already know he viewed his wives as objects, and so he just probably felt entitled.
Over the years, the people on the professional board weren't the only people that Gabe was getting into trouble with or unfortunately being sweet-talked to avoid punishment. In 1996 to 2020, he had 12 interactions with the police. The incidences were all reported to be about him being aggressive and sometimes violent. None resulted in more than a slap on the wrist. He beat up teenagers, broke a guy's nose for dancing with his girlfriend, blackmailed friends and assaulted them. He would just fly off the handle and attack people. Interestingly, in hindsight, there were several incidents that showed particular aggression towards police. In the last reported incident, before his attack on the people of Nova Scotia, he was confrontational about police parking in the clinic parking lot. He took the argument to the next level when he created a blockade around a Halifax police car. Backup needed to be called to defuse him.
No way.
Yeah, he just lost it because he thought they were parking in his parking lot and walking across to the Tim Hortons.
This is obviously a battle of power. He knows that the police are more powerful than him, and he doesn't want to believe that anyone can be. So he's trying to strut his stuff in front of the police and teach them who's more powerful than they are.
But the power is also going to his head. He is getting crazier and crazier.
That's what I mean. I think he totally believes that he's more powerful than the police, and he had to teach them a lesson.
Yeah. Could you imagine blocking in a police car?
No.
Yeah. He was a ticking time bomb. Prior to that, in 2011, it was reported that he was telling people that he wanted to, quote, kill a cop. Along with that fact, the informant notified the police that Gabe possessed several long rifles and at least 1 handgun. Unfortunately, no meaningful investigation was ever conducted.
What?
Yeah, it seemed like it was, again, just chalked up to Gabe being under a lot of stress and being a hothead.
So now he's just feeling invincible. I can do all of these things. I can assault women at my practice. I can threaten cops' lives, and nothing's going to happen to me.
Right.
Other than a couple counseling sessions.
And $8,000. What is $8,000 when he's depositing $130 in one time?
It's nothing.
Yeah.
Chump change.
Exactly. And I'm sure he viewed it that way. The information about the guns was forgotten. And in the other altercations that he had, Gabe would deny that he had any guns at all. But Gabe was a lying dirtbag. So why would he ever be honest about any guns that he had? He wasn't honest about anything else, especially with Lisa. In 2002, the cottage that they purchased had been bought to be made into a beautiful retreat. It would become that for each of them in different ways. Gabe would retreat to party. And for Lisa, the property became a temporary reprieve. Gabe started to spend weekends up there, and that gradually turned into 3 days and then 4 days. And Lisa would usually go only there on weekends, or sometimes not even at all, preferring to use the excuse of Gabe being away at the cottage as a way to spend weekends with her sisters. Over the 19 years that they had spent together, Gabe gradually had started to restrict Lisa's contact with her family.
Oh.
Lisa's family knew about the abuse. It wasn't a secret from anyone. Gabe separated her from her family because he was probably fearful of them trying to talk her into leaving him. Lisa was fearful that if she left Gabe, he would make good on his promises to hurt her family. And her family feared that the only way that Lisa would ever leave Gabe was in a body bag.
Oh my goodness. That is such a classic sign of an abuser. So terrible.
And just so much fear from every single side.
Right. It makes them feel like their hands are tied.
Yes. Separating a loved one from family is a tactic used by a lot of abusers. By separating someone from their family and support system, they become vulnerable and dependent only on the abuser. So when Gabe would go away to the cottage and work on it, Lisa welcomed his time away from the cottage because when the honeymoon period in their relationship had worn off, Lisa had learned what kind of a man Gabe really was. One that beat, coerced, and manipulated those around him, and those that loved him were at the most risk. Gabe angered easily, and his moods were unpredictable and disproportionate. Lisa said that she could never know how he was going to react to anything, so she was always walking on eggshells. If that wasn't enough for her to deal with, he was a cheating dirtbag as well, and not overly secretive about it. When he would spend days and weeks at the cottage while Lisa stayed at the clinic to hold down the fort, he entertained a lot. In 2009, he even approached one of his regular mistresses to sign a similar contract to the one he had made Lisa sign.
Oh.
Yeah. Gabe was always so concerned about others being entitled to his money. It sounded like he was happy to support her as a kept mistress, essentially a second common law partner. But just like Lisa, he didn't want her to have access to any of his money if they should ever split up.
Right. He wanted control of it all.
Yes. This woman was fully aware that he wanted to keep her just on the side and that he was in a committed relationship with Lisa. But the relationship soured after her refusal to sign the contract, and they eventually did break up. Gabe, she said, would become cranky every time they were together afterwards because she wouldn't sign the contract.
Oh, that would have driven him crazy.
Mm-hmm. And so she eventually left. She fled.
Good.
Another woman he engaged with was a woman named in the inquest only as EE to protect her identity. She and Gabe met in 2014 when she was living in Portapique by herself, and the two became, quote, good friends.
With benefits.
Yeah. They seem like like-minded individuals. EE was described as being involved in biker culture. They frequently got drunk, did drugs, and engaged in sexual activity, occasionally threesomes. EE would even play matchmaker for Gabe and other young women. The way she described setting up one of these interactions to the police later was very vulgar, saying that the young woman had been asking about what it was like to be with a, quote, big one. So she had sent her over to Gabe's.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I have some suspicion that this was possibly her daughter.
No.
Yeah. Or at least someone that felt like she was a daughter to her. There were a lot of names that were redacted in the official report for safety or preference. So I've followed suit and left their names out as well, but I think there was a connection between these two. She was definitely in a position of trust when she sent this young girl over to Gabe.
Gross.
Uh-huh.
She honestly sounds almost just as reckless as Gabe.
Oh, they made a good pair. One young woman would report later to police that she felt like when she was sent over by EE to see Gabe in 2019, that he had put something in her drink because she only vaguely remembered what happened next. She believes that he bathed her and then forced himself on her. It was a pattern that he would use with several women that he brought to the cottage. And this was one of the incident reports that was recorded by the police. They were initially called to EE's place because the 3 women were having an altercation. 2 wanted to leave, and EE wouldn't let them go. When the police came to investigate, this young woman had mentioned the sexual assault. But a supposedly believable story was made up about this girl being drunk, and the investigation wasn't thoroughly pursued at the time.
Oh, and was she underage?
She wasn't underage. I believe she was 19 or in her early 20s.
Okay.
So she wasn't a minor, but way younger than these 2.
Yeah.
There were questions raised afterwards as to if any investigation was done, because the police hadn't even gone into the warehouse in Portapique where the young girl claimed the assault had began. If the police had gone in that warehouse, they surely would have noticed what Gabe had begun to collect. Gabe had always been a collector of things. As he accumulated more wealth, those collections grew. He collected vintage Honda motorcycles, and then he started to collect guns. In April of 2020, he'd accumulated at least 5 illegal weapons. Some of his weapons included a Glock 23 semi-automatic pistol with a CTC laser point grip attached, a Ruger P89 semi-automatic pistol, again with a laser point grip attached, a Colt carbine semi-automatic rifle, a Remington Arms Wingmaster 12-gauge shotgun, and a Ruger Mini 17 semi-automatic rifle. That was the one that he had inherited from Tom. 3 of these firearms he had smuggled into Canada from Holton, Maine, in the United States, from a friend of Tom's. One of the most shocking things that I learned while researching this case was that Gabe had actually qualified for a Nexus account, which made it easy for him to cross the border with little or no questioning.
No way.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised, really.
It's crazy. There were several things about his past that should have flagged him during the application process for Nexus, but it didn't.
For sure. He probably wasn't even honest on there.
Oh, I can't imagine he was. But even his past altercations, threatening people with guns and having guns that weren't registered, should have flagged him.
Totally.
This pass essentially allowed him to bring weapons across the border without question.
Do you think he handed in his application with a big wad of bills?
Oh, maybe.
Not that I'm accusing anybody of anything, but it does seem very suspicious.
I don't understand how he could be given that pass with his history. Gabe was very aware that having these guns without proper licenses was illegal. There were several internet searches done on his computers on that exact topic that would prove that he was not ignorant of these laws. So he was researching the laws and ways to get around them. Gabe also possessed significant amounts of ammunition for all of these firearms and a hand grenade.
Oh.
Gabe had hiding places all around the cottage and the warehouse in Portapique and his home in Dartmouth. He frequently bragged about having these guns and would freely show them off to family members and friends, being particularly proud of the ingenious ways he hid them. At least 35 people knew of the types of guns that he kept.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody reported him?
No. Lisa said she was fully aware of them because at times they were held to her head as an intimidation tactic.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry, I shouldn't say that nobody reported to them because 3 of his 12 police incidents had actually mentioned these guns.
Okay. But he wasn't investigated for them.
No, nobody looked into it.
This is fishy.
Yeah. Gabe had also started to collect cars, and one very particular type of car. Gabe purchased 4 decommissioned police vehicles. He was able to purchase them from the GC Surplus, the Government of Canada Movable Assets online auction site. GC Surplus is a closed bidding system that sells movable assets, including vehicles, from more than 100 departments and agencies within the Government of Canada. So it's a totally legit place to buy things from. But it's also supposed to be tracked, and it wasn't at the time. Of the 4 Tauruses he purchased, 3 were 2013 models, and 1 was a 2017 model. One of the cars was used by Lisa to drive around in, 1 was used by Gabe to drive around in, and 1 was used for spare parts. All were registered to his Berkshire Broman Corporation, so they weren't registered to them personally. He was putting everything through the business. The last car, a 2013 model, Gabe purchased on June 27th, 2019 for $10,990.
And all of this is just a write-off for his business.
Yes. This car was used to create a replica of a police cruiser, and it was never registered. When he purchased the cars, they had been in a decommissioned state. That meant that all the police equipment and stickers had been removed from the cars. With a little finagling and a whole lot of cash, Gabe purchased reflective vinyl, decals, light bars, metal, and plexiglass and restored this car to its former glory, complete with a silent patrolman, the divider between the front and back seats. After a lot of research, he purchased a police push bumper ram bar, gun racks, light consoles, sirens, decals, a K-band radar calibration tuning fork, the special police console that went in the middle of the car, wheel hub covers, emblems, municipal TS2 moving radar, reflective safety tape, and a Motorola Palm microphone. Most of this he ordered off of eBay or Amazon, and a few things he even got from this GC surplus.
That is wild, Melissa.
It is.
He should never have been able to get his hands on those things.
But he was just making small individual purchases, and so nobody put together what he was using all of this for.
Right. One thing at a time doesn't seem as suspicious.
Right. The 4 cars, though, should have flagged somebody.
Yeah.
But he bought them over an extended period of time. It wasn't like he bought them all at once. And so it didn't flag in their system.
And now he has a vehicle that can pass perfectly for a police vehicle.
Exactly. The exterior of the car was no easy feat. He couldn't just walk into a place and say, print me an RCMP logo. So he ordered most things from the States. He had to have most of the decos shipped to a border town, and then he would drive across and pick the items up. At other times, he commissioned just small parts of a decal from local businesses. So not the whole deco or the whole picture, but just pieces of it. Sometimes he used his coercion tactics to twist arms into doing what he asked for. A lot of the people in businesses actually refused to create the decals for him. At the time, the specifications for these items, like the decals, were publicly available. So he wasn't asking them to do anything illegal, but it just felt plain wrong to them, so they didn't want to do it. Apparently, the horse deco was the hardest one for him to get somebody to print. For the things that he couldn't buy or get made, he fabricated himself. He actually bought huge rolls of vinyl and just did it himself.
Ow.
Yeah. Gabe was exacting in the details. And as a denturist, I'm sure that was a trait that was drilled into him, right down to including a call sign on the car, 28B11.
You mean the ID number?
Yes, it's the number that goes on every cruiser that tells you which area it's from, what unit it belongs to, and where it sits in their fleet. When he was complete with this car, it was almost a carbon copy of the cars being used by police in Nova Scotia.
And was that number actually being used by the police?
It wasn't.
Okay. But nobody would know that at first glance.
No. It looked totally like a real car. And the crazy thing was, he wasn't overly secretive about this car's creation. He bragged about it a lot. A lot of people knew about Gabe's police car. He didn't just go driving it around because that would be wrong, of course. It wasn't registered. But he did show it off to almost everybody that visited the warehouse where it was stored.
But a lot of people would just think, oh, that's just his little toy, his project he's been doing.
Right.
How cool is that he has an actual restored police car?
Yeah, people's reactions were mixed. Some thought it was cool. Some even marveled at its authenticity. And others found this outright bizarre. Who needed a replica police car? When people raised questions about what he could possibly want to do with a police car, he told them that he was going to drive it in parades as a memorial to police that had died in Moncton.
Oh, yeah, right.
Gabe also told another individual that he planned to rent the car out to movie sets.
That's more believable because then he'd be making some money.
Right. It was kind of odd, but again, he's this rich, eccentric person, so people kind of bought it. No one ever reported it to the police with concerns.
I honestly would have felt like it's just this rich guy with one of his new toys.
I think I would too.
He's just so rich, he feels entitled to have a police car because nobody else does.
To go along with his car collection, in January of 2018, Gabe also started searching out and collecting other police paraphernalia in earnest. He already had some things, but now he's on the hunt for specifics. Uniforms, hats, a belt, and handcuffs were acquired. Some from family and friends, because he had 2 uncles that were actually retired RCMP officers.
Oh, wow.
By 2020, he had collected several items from RCMP uniforms. Some were elements of the RCMP uniform dress, like the red Sarge jacket, the high brown boots, and the Sam Brown belt. And he also had these dark blue pants with the yellow stripe down them. So it was like their formal uniform. He even had a Stetson hat to go along with it. And then he had also collected pieces from their duty uniforms, which included a shirt and their plain pants that didn't have the stripe down the side.
Their everyday wear.
Right. He had handcuffs and a bulletproof vest. And to round it all out, he even had a paramedic's badge, a firefighter's outfit, and a military uniform. You just never know when you're going to need one of those.
Oh, that is terrifying.
But he's a collector, and so Lisa didn't give it much thought because Gabe was always kind of odd collecting different things. She said when he was younger, he had wanted to join the RCMP, so it all kind of made sense to her.
Living out his boyhood fantasy.
Right. As Gabe amassed his collection of police memorabilia, his mental state deteriorated, and he became more and more paranoid. According to Lisa's sister, Gabe started to try and purchase a lot of land in Portapique, but several neighbors declined his offer. Apparently, his paranoia had led him to believe that they should be establishing a family kind of compound.
Okay.
It was a really weird side angle of this whole case, where he had this idea to create a compound where Lisa and all of her sisters could live once they were all retired. But at the same time, he kept Lisa away from her sisters.
Yeah, that's not jiving.
No, it's not. But it was apparently one of these things that he had tried to convince her sister to do. He gave her a property in the area.
He gave her the property?
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, that does not jive with how he's been.
You're right. I think you can see real paranoia setting in. He's not even thinking like he normally did before.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Almost becoming a little delusional.
Right. And I wonder if being paranoid was also an indicator that he was wrapped up into some really nefarious dealings. When you are doing something wrong or engaging with dangerous people, I think it's only a natural progression to always be looking over your shoulder and wanting to create a safe place. And that sounds exactly like what Gabe was trying to do.
True.
He wanted to surround himself with just people he knew and people he trusted. He didn't want any outsiders.
Which would explain why he's now involving the sister.
Mm-hmm. And then COVID hit. And Gabe really started to spiral. A lot of people did get a little squirrely in the early days of the pandemic. It was a little scary. But I can't help but wonder if it was worse in Gabe's mind. Because all of a sudden, he wasn't able to work or travel. And those two things were how he brought in a lot of business dealings. And without them, I can imagine the money would dry up fairly soon.
With the way he spends it, for sure.
Yeah. On March 10th, 2020, Gabe and Lisa moved to the cottage permanently because there was no need to stay in Dartmouth because the dental clinics were closed. Nobody was coming to them. He became increasingly paranoid and was drinking more and more. Gabe was always worse when he was drinking. And with his mental health declining, alcohol only made it worse. He had seen a psychologist prior to 2020, but it wasn't a lasting intervention. As the pandemic hit, he developed the mentality that he had to be preparing for something big. Gabe became agitated and sedentary all at the same time. Gabe was usually a very active person, always having to be doing something. But when he got to the cottage, he spent most of his time laying in bed, watching and listening to the news about the pandemic. He would watch for hours and hours, becoming hyper-focused on what was happening.
Oh, that's not healthy.
No. He would say things like, the world's going to end, and people are going to get desperate, and we have to protect ourselves. He would talk about how they would be able to use the police car to escape. No one would stop them in it. After a time, he became more and more convinced that COVID was a government conspiracy. He was not shy about sharing his ideas that the Prime Minister of Canada would soon begin to control people's money, and how he felt others were not prepared for what was going to happen, and that's why he had to be well armed in advance.
And from what I recall, I don't think he was alone in his thoughts.
No, but what made Gabe different was he had the means to follow on these paranoid plans. He already had a really good arsenal of weapons.
Mm-hmm.
He started telling Lisa that they had to load up on things like groceries, fuel, and ammunition.
And toilet paper.
And toilet paper.
That was a big thing in Canada. We ran out of toilet paper.
I think that was a big thing everywhere.
I didn't personally, but I know a lot of people did.
And Gabe really started to load up to the point that his neighbors started noticing. Gabe started stockpiling gasoline, $500 to $600 worth, in cans around his house, along with propane tanks. And a few neighbors reported hearing him brag about having lime and muriatic acid to dispose of bodies at his property at Portapique.
No.
Yeah, he's going to the next level.
Like, I'm going to kill anyone who comes after my stuff, and then I'm going to dissolve them in lime.
Right. He had told several people that when I go out, I'm going out with a bang. It'll be on the news.
Oh, man.
While most people took these statements to be an over-exaggeration, E.E. later told police that when Gabe had told her that he was going out with a bang and that she would see or hear it, she waited for it. She expected Gabe to do something, although she didn't know what he was going to do, just that she felt like he would go through with something.
Ooh.
On the 19th of March, Gabe withdrew $475,000 in cash from the bank.
Oh. I wonder if the bank saw a lot of that, people panicking and pulling their money out.
Yeah, it didn't really stand out to them. A lot of people wanted to withdraw funds from their accounts and have cash on hand. But that was a lot of cash that he was liquidating.
Yeah, getting close to $500,000.
Yeah. He was hostile towards the bank employees when they couldn't arrange to give him the money as quickly as he wanted. He actually ended up having to go to the Brinks facility to get the money because the bank would not allow that much money to be in the building at one time. And he didn't want to make several trips to pick up the money over certain days.
Yeah, it's not how banks operate, and there's a reason why.
Yeah. When the bank manager raised concerns about the safety of carrying around that much cash, Gabe was undeterred. He acted like it was nothing for him to move that much cash around, and he was even annoyed. He took the cash and combined it with other cash that he had stockpiled and buried it in a duffel bag at the cottage. Hiding money wasn't exactly a new thing for him. In the past, he had hidden sums of $200,000 in the floorboards of their Dartmouth home. At another time, he had hid another $200,000 in his lab in a toolbox. So hiding money wasn't a new thing for him.
But he actually buried this, like outside?
Yes, this one he buried. Investigators would later find $700,000 and $5,000 in 50s and $100 bills in a duffel bag in a crawl space under the deck of the cottage.
That honestly would make me more nervous. I'd be always checking. Is it still there? Did anyone find it? I'd have to camp out beside it.
Yeah.
Honestly, that would increase my paranoia.
To just have something outside where you didn't always have eyes on it. Somebody wasn't always watching it.
Right. Your floorboards, okay, that would be okay. But outside on your property?
Yeah.
That makes me anxious just thinking about it.
$705,000. An additional $40,000 was also found in other locations that he had hid.
Oh, that was just their pocket change.
It was probably their quick access. They didn't have to dig for that stuff. It was just one of the many shocking findings after the murders of 22 people. On April 18th, Lisa and Gabe were at the cottage celebrating their 19th anniversary. Remember, I said that it wasn't their actual anniversary, but they had chosen April 19th. And so they were pre-celebrating as best they could under pandemic restrictions. They spent the day out driving around in their Jeep. And when they returned home, they had some drinks and listened to music at the warehouse and talked to a few friends over FaceTime. They had this warehouse that was a short distance away from the cottage. It was actually on its own property, but they could get to it through the woods. There was like a path through the woods. And in the warehouse was where he kept all of his motorcycles. He kept his cars, but there was also a bar and an upper loft area that was like a little apartment. And that's where most of the parties were held.
It sounds pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, it does. But it wasn't like a regular warehouse.
Right. So this is where they were spending some of their anniversary.
Yes. It's where he liked to entertain.
So Lisa could be at the cottage and he could be over there, living it up.
Exactly.
It was like his giant man cave.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
So they were there at the warehouse and they had talked to a few friends over FaceTime. Shortly after 6:30, a fight broke out between the two about their friends planning a commitment ceremony the following year.
So she wanted one too.
No, not that she wanted one, but Gabe had told his friends not to go through with it, and this upset Lisa, so she stormed off. She was ticked off at him.
Yeah, no kidding.
She started to go through the woods to the cottage, but decided to turn around, and she wanted to apologize for taking off on their anniversary. When she returned, Gabe was irate. It had taken him less than 5 minutes to snap. He launched into a tirade of insults, and it wasn't very long before she was feeling the need to flee. Lisa left Gabe and returned to the cottage alone and went to bed. Shortly after, she heard Gabe return home, but instead of coming directly into the house, she could hear him outside and this nondescript kind of whistling sound. What she would later come to realize was that Gabe was pouring gasoline around the perimeter of their house.
No way.
Yeah. But she didn't realize that in the moment. She just thought, that's a weird sound. Like, what is he doing out there? When he was done, Gabe burst into the room and started screaming at her, "I'm done." He dragged her from the bed and started to beat and strangle her, screaming at her that she would never look at him again the same way. He kicked her across the room, literally launched her across the room. She heard an audible crack at the time. During this attack, she would break her ribs and a vertebrae.
No way.
Yeah, but the attack wasn't done. As she struggled to get to her feet, not realizing that she had broken her back, he launched her up with her hair and forced her to get dressed and told her to get ready to leave. When she, out of habit, tried to grab at her purse, Gabe said she didn't need it. He tied her up and then he moved them through the house, spreading more gasoline on the inside. So much that they were slipping on the floor as they exited the house.
Oh, how terrifying for her.
Yeah. Outside, he poured gas on the Taurus that was in the driveway, and Lisa tried to calm him down. Gabe told her that, quote, "At the end of this night, I'll be dead, and if you don't run away from me, you won't be." He marched them back to the warehouse. Lisa tried once to lay down on the ground and just refused to go with him. She started to kick and scream, but Gabe was undeterred. He hauled her up again and ripped off her shoes and threw them into the bush. He now made her walk in her bare feet. She tried to run again, and as she was trying to run away, he pulled the coat right off of her, and it went into the woods too. He caught her and threatened her again. She tried digging her bare heels into the road as they crossed it, but she couldn't stop him from dragging her into the warehouse. He was over 6 feet tall, and she was barely 5'5". She was tiny. She didn't have a chance against this huge guy. At the warehouse, Gabe started spreading more gasoline on all of the vehicles parked outside and around the building. When they went into the warehouse, Lisa again fell to the floor and refused to get up. Gabe fired 2 shots into the concrete floor on either side of her head. Handcuffed one of her hands and threw her into the back seat of the replica cruiser. He went to retrieve guns that he had hidden behind the bar. He threw them into the front seat and then went to retrieve something from the upstairs apartment. While he was gone, somehow Lisa was able to slide the handcuff off of her one hand and open the sliding window in the divider between the front and back seats. She couldn't recall how she fit through the opening, and I can't figure it out either. But she says she just dove through it and somehow was able to get into the front seat of the cruiser.
It was nothing short of a miracle, because she's got broken ribs in a back at this time too.
Well, she's in total survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
Once in the front seat, she was able to open the door because the back door is locked.
Right.
You can't get out of them from the inside. He had literally made it just like a cruiser. Once out of the cruiser, she ran into the woods and hid, too terrified to do anything else. From her hiding place in the woods, she saw the cottage and the warehouse go up in flames, and she heard 2 men talking, and then more gunshots and more gunshots.
2 men talking?
Yes, we'll get to that. Her decision to run that night and not stay in the car with Gabe is one that Lisa says she is haunted by. She says she wonders if anyone else would have died that night if she had just stayed.
Oh my gosh.
She feels like the next people to die were put in Gabe's path because he was out looking for her because she had ran.
Oh, so she has massive survivor's guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were saying this too, I was thinking, what about that poor couple that they were FaceTiming with? If you found out later that it was your renewal ceremony that lit this match, that started this fight, it's not your fault, but you would feel horrible. How could you even have that ceremony and feel not haunted by it?
Right. Just like Lisa, I think it would be a normal reaction to try and find some way to explain what happens next.
Even though neither of them were at fault at all.
Right. But it still would be a sombering thought to live with, because in less than an hour, 13 people would be dead.
Goodness.
Gabe's precise movements through Portapique that night, after his assault on Lisa, are not known exactly. The timeline that I'll go through today is one that was determined to be most likely by the inquest, but it's probably not 100% accurate. A lot happens, and Gabe continues to burn evidence along the way. Minutes after setting the warehouse on fire, Gabe arrived at Greg and Jamie Blair's house. It was only 81 meters or 88 yards from the warehouse. Greg, 45, and Jamie were sitting on their deck as they watched their neighbor approach. Without warning, Gabe shot Greg in the chest, torso, and arm, and he died almost instantly. Can you imagine? He's just walking up to them and they're like, hey, there's their neighbor coming, thinking probably he wants to say hi or something.
Right. Dropping off banana bread. Jamie's call to 911 went through at 10:01. And she says her neighbor just shot her husband.
it's clear she is completely confused at what has just happened as she tries to comprehend and relay the information that Gabe was driving a police car. She says, quote, "There's a police car, but he's a denturist. He drives like there's an RCMP. It's decked and labeled RCMP, but it's not a police officer." As she's on the phone with 911, she gathers the couple's 2 children, 11 and 10, into the master bedroom and tells them to hide between the bed and the wall. Gabe entered the house and, after shooting the family's dog and cat, made his way to the bedroom where Jamie was between the door and her children.
Oh my goodness.
Gabe opened fire on the closed door, and the shots can be heard on the 911 call. After shooting her multiple times through the door, he opened it and shot her one more time, killing her at approximately 10:04. At the same time, police were dispatched to the area.
She died trying to protect her children.
Yeah. In her dying moments, this courageous woman had protected her children and given the police vital pieces of information about this dirtbag. It was information that wasn't fully appreciated until much later. Gabe was driving a car that looked identical to a police car. Gabe never bothered to go looking for the children. Instead, he headed to the family's burning wood stove and started pulling logs from it and started spreading them and other debris around the living room floor. Before leaving the house, he turned on the gas stove and placed items on top of it as well. The children hid as long as they could until the smoke in the house became too thick, and then in desperation, they left their hiding place, passing their mother's body to flee to safety.
Oh my. That's terrible, Melissa.
What these kids go through is so horrific.
And I am so relieved that he didn't go looking for them.
But their night's not done yet. At approximately 10:16, the kids ran to their next-door neighbor's house. This was the house that had been part of the land dispute between Gabe and his uncles. Just prior to this, it had been sold to Lisa McCulley. Lisa, 49, who lived in the house with her children aged 10 and 12, was a beloved elementary school teacher of nearby Debert. She had always loved the quiet outdoors that surrounded Portapique. It was where she biked and snowshoed and could fish, but this night was anything from quiet and peaceful. Lisa had told her younger child that she was going out to investigate the noises that she was hearing in the woods. There were flames that she could see coming from the warehouse. She grabbed her cell and told her child to stay in the house and went out to see if she could help as the explosions were heard around her. Because around the warehouse was all these propane tanks that he had bought. And so there were explosions going off.
Right. And she's probably thinking this is an accident.
Yeah. One of the most tragic things to learn about was how often victims were put in harm's way when they went out to help a neighbor or check on something suspicious. They were watching out for each other. It was so difficult to learn about because it's very much a culture in rural Nova Scotia. Like so many small communities, you watch out for one another. And that kindness was used against them by a dirtbag. When she opened the door at approximately 10:08, she could see Gabe. This was known because her child heard their mom call out their neighbor's name and ask him what was going on as she closed the door.
Oh, so he wouldn't have shot her if she hadn't come outside?
Well, it's hard to say because there are some that believe that his motivation to collect properties around him led to which houses he stopped at.
Right. So maybe he was going to stop, but she was right there and he's like, oh, perfect.
Yeah. He actually drives back and forth, passing his house several times. It's just bizarre. And that's what I mean. Yes, he was a dirtbag, but there was something going on mentally that he was not all there.
No, because after murdering people, you want to get away from the crime scene, not be driving back and forth around it.
Right. But maybe he felt safety because he was in a police car. He was just one of them and he felt like he could hide amongst them. Lisa was shot by her front fence as Gabe drove past, going south on Orchard Beach Drive towards Cobequid Court. The Blair children did not see Lisa on the property line as they ran for their lives to the safety of her home. They were just so focused at finding help. At 10:16, once all 4 children are in Lisa's house, they make their own call to 911. This call would last over 2 hours as the call taker remained on the line with them until they could be evacuated from the house.
I can't even imagine that 911 operator. How terrifying that would have been even for them.
Yeah.
That's another victim of this case.
It's so awful.
4 children by themselves after seeing their mothers be murdered.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's terrible.
Police did locate Lisa at 10:59 that night, and they were aware that children were in the house, but the decision was made that it was safer to keep them there and guard them from the outside of the house because at the time they didn't know where Gabe was. Initially, when the officers found the children, they had told them to stay inside in the basement and not answer the door to anyone who didn't use the code word pineapple. That's because, with shots still being heard all around them, the police that initially found the children left them there to go search for Gabe.
What?
Yeah.
Melissa, that should not have happened.
Well, I'm on the fence about this one. It would have been such a difficult decision to make. Do you protect the children in front of you? Or do you leave and protect more people by going after the dirtbag?
You do both. You leave an officer with them and send the rest to go look for him.
Yeah. The officers chose to go looking for Gabe. There were only 3 of them at the time. The decision would later be defended by saying that in an immediate action rapid deployment protocol, the basic principle is to stop the threat. So they tried their best to protect the children by saying, go to the basement, stay there, don't open the door to anybody, stay hidden. But they were after Gabe.
Which does make sense. But to leave them there for 2 hours, you couldn't call any sort of backup to come and get them?
There's a lot of miscommunication that goes on during this case.
And they're probably worried they'll put someone else in harm's way by approaching the home.
Yeah. When backup arrives, because they didn't know where Gabe was, initially they didn't want to bring in more RCMP officers because that would put more people at risk. It was, again, a decision that would be criticized.
But they are acting under duress and just doing what they think they should in the spur of that moment.
Right. One officer would describe the scene as sounding like a war zone. With the roar of the flames from the houses that were caught on fire, there was gunshots continually going off, and explosions were coming from the propane tanks that Gabe had accumulated around the warehouse. It was dark, and smoke that was gathering in the forest made it extremely difficult to see. So this is the kind of conditions that they're working under.
It's a nightmare.
Mm-hmm. So I can kind of understand why the decision was made to leave the children there. But it was one that was largely criticized. Gabe was still on the loose. He was heading south to Cobequid Court. There he came across Joy and Peter Bond and Jolene Oliver, Oliver Tuck, and Emily Tuck. The 2 families again had gathered at the entrances of their home, likely concerned about the noise and the flames that were rising around them. The 2 families lived 60 meters apart from each other, and their bodies wouldn't be discovered until 4:50 p.m. the next day. In the chaos and the mismanagement of everything that was going around, there was no centralized command set up, and so that's how long it took to organize a systematic search of the area to look for other fatalities. That is a long time, considering that there was a large police presence in the area. And family members were contacting the police concerned because they couldn't get a hold of their loved ones. Joy, 70, and Peter, 74, had been enjoying their retirement together. After Peter's long career as a truck driver, Joy loved to bake for her grandchildren. Their neighbor Jolene, at 39, was a local waitress that could make anyone feel that they were family. And Aaron, 45, was a gifted artist working in leather and glass and had a knack with old cars. Together, they had raised and cherished their only daughter, Emily. As a headstrong but loving 17-year-old, she was just getting her life started. All 5 of these people had known Gabe as a neighbor. And afterwards, it was found out that Gabe had tried to purchase Aaron and Jolene's property for well below market value and had been refused. After leaving Cobequid Court, Gabe, still driving the replica RCMP car, went back north, the direction that he had just come from, passing the warehouse and the Blair and McCully homes. He pulled into the U-shaped driveway of Don and Frank Glenchen, retirees that had moved to the area from Ontario. They were enjoying a good life, carefully renovating their dream home after a lifetime of work. Unfortunately, they didn't get much time to enjoy it. In the driveway of 71 Orchard Beach Drive, with his vehicle facing south, his driver's side window was facing the Glenchens' front door. Gabe got out and shot the couple and then set the house on fire. While Gabe was destroying life and property, neighbors of his and his victims, Andrew and Kate McDonald, left their home to see what was going on and to see if anyone needed help. They left their home shortly before 10:25 and went to investigate. When they drove past the Glenchens' home originally, they did see the RCMP car in the driveway. It didn't stand out to them at all. They just figured it was a cop coming to investigate. When they pulled up to the fire and realized it was Gabe's warehouse, they tried to locate his contact information and get a hold of him.
Trying to help him out.
Mm-hmm.
And they would have had that false sense of security, believing that police were already on scene.
Exactly. When they couldn't find Gabe's contact information in their phones, they called 911 at 10:25 and headed back to where they had seen that RCMP car.
Oh.
The Glenchens' home is now on fire too. They could see flames coming from the large picture window, and it was spreading quickly. They pulled into the driveway opposite of the cruiser just as it was pulling out. On the 911 call, Andrew can be heard saying, quote, "The police officer is parked at this driveway, but I don't know that, he's coming around. I don't know if he's going to talk to me or what." Gabe pulls the cruiser back into the driveway, this time in the opposite direction, pulling up alongside the McDonald's car so that the passenger window of the Taurus is closest to the driver's side window of the McDonald's car. From police reports, the vehicles were, quote, approximately 2 feet apart. The perpetrator pointed a handgun that was emitting a laser-pointed sighting. Mr. McDonald recognized the perpetrator and knew he was not an actual police officer. On seeing the beam of laser, the couple realized the perpetrator was about to shoot them and quickly ducked down. The perpetrator fired 2 shots through the replica RCMP cruiser's passenger window toward the driver's side window of the McDonald's vehicle.
Oh, wow.
The shots can be heard at 10:27:11 on the 911 recording. Andrew was shot in the shoulder and another bullet grazed his head, but he was still alert enough to hear his wife scream, "Drive." He floored it, telling the dispatcher that it was his neighbor that shot him. As they were fleeing, Gabe pursues them in the cruiser, and following them, in a white Honda Accent, was David Faulkner, another neighbor that was out to see what was going on. All 3 vehicles at this time are traveling north, and after about 350 meters, Gabe gave up pursuing them and turned in another direction as they entered the intersection of Orchard Beach Drive and Portapique Beach Road. Thankfully, Dave Faulkner followed the McDonald's, and both came across the first real RCMP officer to arrive on the scene.
Oh man, it feels like it's taken a long time.
Mm-hmm. But this is actually just minutes.
Oh, for sure.
It's all within a half an hour.
That's just wild.
Again, the witnesses relayed critical pieces of information that seemed minor at the time, but crucial in identifying Gabe later. David told the officers that he had traveled behind the cruiser and he had noticed that there were no lights on it, not even tail lights. It was the only thing that was odd about this car. Otherwise, it looked exactly like the RCMP cars that he was now standing right beside.
Purposefully no lights on it?
I think that the car just wasn't finished completely. They weren't hooked up.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. The light bar was installed, but it didn't turn on.
Gotcha.
Although not officially clear why this critical piece of information was not made widely known, it was a huge error because it was the only way to tell this car apart from other RCMP cars.
Oh, it's so scary.
Yeah.
To think of what these people were going through.
The 4 officers that had shown up on scene decided to take the IR approach to the situation, and 3 officers entered the community on foot, while 1 stayed behind to establish a roadblock and get Andrew medical aid. So they didn't want anybody else going into the community because they could become potential victims. And so they sent only 3 in, and they didn't send any medical support into the community. Police established a roadblock at Portapique Road at 10:41, blocking access to the main highway number 2. The 3 that entered the area were unfamiliar with the community and the geography. They were just the first ones that had arrived on scene, and so they went in. To make matters worse, it was dark, there were no streetlights, and smoke filled the air. There was limited cell service in the area, and so they had tried to use their personal cell phones to try and orientate themselves to where the roads were, but the map system didn't work very well. At the same time, explosions and sounds like gunshots are surrounding them in the air.
Just complete chaos.
Mm-hmm. After stopping his pursuit of the McDonald's, Gabe turned south on Portapique Road again, traveling past his cottage to the home of Joanne Thomas and John Zoll. John, 70, had retired from the U.S. Navy, and Joanne, 58, had retired from healthcare. John was one of the neighbors that Gabe had approached to buy his property and again been turned down. They were Gabe's immediate next-door neighbors, so there's no rhyme or reason about why he's choosing which homes to go into, unless he was seeking out people that had turned him down.
Right. And he's going back and forth.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense. Joanne and John were active members in this small community and contributed so much of their time to charity work. It is believed that Gabe entered their home and shot them first to prevent them from calling the police, and then he set their home on fire. After leaving their home, Gabe must have driven on the private trail from his cottage to his warehouse. And that's how he was able to avoid being seen by the officers who were now making their way down the road on foot, because they didn't see him come out of that driveway. At the fully engulfed warehouse, Gabe turned south onto Orchard Beach Drive and came across Corey Ellison. Corey, 42, had been in Portapique with his brother visiting their dad, who lived about 450 meters from the warehouse. He was the outdoorsy type and loved music and football. The three men, Corey, his brother, and his dad, had seen the flames and had heard what they thought were gunshots. Corey and Clinton wanted to go out and investigate to make sure nobody needed help. They had grown up in the area and they were concerned. Their dad warned them to stay away from Gabe's property because he was a, quote, bad cat. When they arrived at the end of the driveway, Clinton turned around, but Corey didn't. He wanted to investigate a little bit further. At 10:36, he called his dad and told him that it was Gabe's warehouse that was on fire. Gabe came across Corey at approximately 10:40 as he was taking photos on his cell phone of the warehouse fire.
Oh, no.
At 10:40:12, a final photograph was captured on his phone. This photograph is completely dark with no discernible images. And I just thought, how eerie is that?
Yeah, it was probably as he was going down.
Mm-hmm. Based on the trajectory of bullets and DNA on Gabe's boots, Gabe initially shot Corey from inside the vehicle and then got out to shoot him again. These shots were most likely the ones that the officers had heard while making the decision to stay and protect the children or go after Gabe.
Yeah, it's hard to judge because I can't even imagine what this would have been like for any of the people involved.
No, it was utter chaos. After killing Corey, Gabe left the community on a small dirt track that was known in the community as Blueberry Field Road. It was an unmarked, unofficial road that ran alongside a blueberry field and connected Cobequid Court to Brown Loop and ultimately to Highway 2. He was caught on video surveillance at Wilson's Gas Stop service station in Great Village, about 10 kilometers from Portapique, at 10:51. He was traveling very fast. Unlike other emergency vehicles captured on this camera, this cruiser didn't have its light bar, headlights, or taillights on. So I think it was just as he was setting up the vehicle, he hadn't connected the lights yet.
Right.
Which leads me to believe that, again, this was a snap decision. It wasn't something that he was planning on doing, because if you're planning on impersonating a police officer to get away with murder, you would have made sure that your lights were on. You would fit in better that way.
Oh, totally.
Right? You wouldn't attract attention from having no taillights as you're driving out of the community at 11 p.m.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
He totally snapped.
Mm-hmm. As police established a perimeter around the community to contain Gabe, they blocked the roads that they knew about. Mapping in rural areas is always problematic. Their maps didn't have the Blueberry Road on it. And the police that were initially there setting up the perimeter didn't know about this road. Their mistake was eventually caught and the road would be shut down, but it would already be too late by this time. Sadly, throughout the night, though, they didn't feel like it was possible that Gabe had escaped in the extra minutes that it took them to close down Blueberry Road.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And they didn't make up a backup plan for if he had escaped. They thought he was contained in this community. And all the while, he was slinking off, getting some rest to start again.
That's terrible.
Yeah, it is.
And then you know, too, that they're just wasting their time looking in that area, oblivious to the fact that he's already gone.
Yeah. The error in shutting down the road was just one of many that would be criticized later. There was a lot of criticism on how the police handled the Portapique scene. They hadn't set up a true command. Officers had arrived and each had jumped into doing whatever they felt needed to be done, with nobody really overseeing the big picture. They were just all in action mode, which I can see because in the mayhem, everybody just wants to help. That is something that would continue throughout the next day. Officers that were even off duty would show up over the next 24 hours to lend their support. They self-deployed. In their angst to get started, many off-duty and on-duty officers went into the field without having a thorough briefing of the situation. All were eager to jump in and help and catch the bad guy. Afterwards, the committee identified that proper procedures were not in place to identify knowledge gaps and help officers deal with the adrenaline and the trauma that they were experiencing. I think it's really important to point out that this was their community as well.
But they were behaving preemptively.
Right. They were in adrenaline mode and trying to prevent him from shooting more people. Their reaction to the situation, I think, is an understandable one, but in many cases, it was not one that helped the situation. Even the next morning, there were officers that were so, I don't want to say excited because that's the wrong word, but had so much adrenaline pumping and wanted to help so bad that they were leaving without being fully briefed as to what he looked like, what he was wearing now, because it was a developing situation and things were changing so rapidly that it was really important to stay completely up to date.
Yeah, and you can see how dangerous this would be. They're acting first, thinking second.
Mm-hmm. It's so sad, but at the same time, I can totally understand the mentality.
Mm-hmm.
You have these people that are trained for action. Overall, there was a lack of information collecting and sharing. Many of the residents shared their knowledge of the replica car and the fact that Gabe was dressed like a police officer. But this information was misinterpreted or not passed along to the community or even other police officers. There was some confusion about the car because police underestimated the quality of the copy. When they pulled reports of Gabe's vehicles, they knew that he had bought decommissioned police cars, but most of the police envisioned Gabe driving around in a cop car that still had some shadows of the emblems that had been removed. And the reports of the lights not being working also caused some confusion because they questioned if the car had a light bar at all. So a lot of people, without seeing the car, envisioned that, oh yeah, you could tell that it was a police car, but there was some way to distinguish it from other police cars. Nobody was really catching the fact that multiple witnesses were telling them it looked exactly like a cop car.
Right. They're thinking it looks like a bunch of high school students did this as a project.
Right. And they're trained professionals, so they think that they're going to be able to recognize one of their own cars against a fake one. They just made this general assumption that the car would be distinguishable from theirs somehow. And there were some that even doubted the reports because it just seemed impossible that somebody would be driving around a car that looked exactly like a police car. But it wasn't impossible.
And when your suspect has all this money, it becomes even less impossible.
Right. Another criticism was that the police had not warned anyone in the community of the potential danger. So people were still coming out of their homes to see what was going on.
Oh my.
And there was a huge delay in looking for survivors. All autopsy reports concluded that everyone had died almost instantly, but that was learned after the fact. At the time, they didn't know if others had been injured and were waiting to be found. So the delay to search for survivors was actually pretty huge.
That's really sad.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was that chance that someone could be injured and needing assistance.
Right. And in fact, there was one person that did survive that had a lot of information to share. Lisa, Gabe's partner, had hid in the woods throughout the night, too terrified to move from where she had fallen over a log.
She wasn't dead.
She wasn't. At 6:35, she crawled to a neighbor's house and police were called. She was picked up by a tactical armored vehicle and was in a complete state of terror while she was interviewed that morning. At first, she didn't know anyone else had actually been hurt. As she learned what happened while she had hid, she began to fill the police in on Gabe's mental state and provide the police with pictures of his police memorabilia and gun collection. At the time, they took note of the guns for sure, but once again, they failed to recognize the significance of the replica cruiser. These critical details that were missed led to what was still to come. The inquiry concluded that, quote, early gaps in capture, transfer, and appreciation of important details shared by the community members clearly shaped the critical incident response. While police were focusing on Portapique and containing the threat there, news was starting to spread about the madman that had opened fire in the small community. The only comforting thought to those outside of the community was that the containment perimeter had been set up, and it wouldn't be until the next morning that everyone realized that it had been breached. On April 18th, 2020, that night, Gabe had drove from Portapique to Debert and stayed overnight in the Debert Business Park, arriving there at 11:10 p.m. He left early the next morning on April 19th, shortly before 5:45 a.m.
Now his and Lisa's anniversary.
Yes. The replica cruiser was spotted by several people overnight. The reports would point out that the cruiser was without lights, with a cop that was acting weird in it.
Oh my goodness.
Unfortunately, these sightings wouldn't take on any relevance until the next morning.
What?
Mm-hmm.
How is that even possible?
Because it wasn't known information that he was driving around in this replica police cruiser.
But everyone who called 911 said that he had been.
Well, nobody called it in because they didn't know that that was something that they should be watching out for.
Oh.
Right? They just thought it was this cop acting weird, driving around without his lights on.
Oh, man.
Shortly after 5:35 a.m., Gabe entered Alana Jenkins and Sean McLeod's home. Gabe knew the couple through a friend, and they had actually hung out before. Sean, 44, and Alana, 36, were honest people that emanated goodness and compassion. Everything that Gabe was not. As he entered their home on Hunter Road, he shot the family dogs and then spent the next 2.5 hours terrorizing the couple that worked for Corrections Canada.
What?
It's believed that some of his uniform pieces that he uses later on came from their house. He shot them between 8:30 and 9 a.m. and then set their home on fire.
Why terrorize them? That seems like a jump from his MO.
I'm not sure. I don't know if they were trying to talk him down the whole time, and it took him that long to actually kill them. They were trained professionals.
Oh, that's true. And they were his friends.
Right. Or maybe they were hiding from him. Nobody really knows exactly what happened in this house because he set it on fire afterwards. The only reason that they know that it took him 2.5 hours from when he entered and shot the dogs to when he shot the people was because of gunshots heard by neighbors. The original gunshots were heard at 6:30 and they could hear the dogs yelping afterwards, so they knew it was the dogs that were shot then. And then further gunshots were heard in between 8:30 and 9. So they don't know what happened, but I'm sure it was complete terror in that home.
Oh, it had to be.
Yeah. Around the same time that the fire was being started, Elena and Sean's neighbor, Tom Bagley, who was just about to turn 71, was out taking his usual morning walk. He lived about 400 meters up the road, and when he passed his neighbor's house and saw it on fire, it was presumed that he went in to see what was going on and to help. He was also shot by Gabe. Tom was a maritimer through and through. He had served in the Navy and then as a firefighter, but his most precious role was Poppy, and Gabe had just left him on the ground without a thought as he fled the scene.
Ugh, he is just so evil.
Yeah. Gabe traveled along Hunter Road toward Highway 4. The car's movement was captured on video surveillance again. Lillian Campbell, 65, had left her home that morning at 9 a.m. for her normal walk, just like Tom. She and her husband were also retirees that had settled in Nova Scotia from the Yukon. She loved the Wentworth community and her new home and enjoyed taking walks in the valley. She and her husband had not heard the news from Portapique that morning. So when she saw an RCMP cruiser pass her and then loop around and come back towards her, she probably didn't think anything sinister was going to happen.
No, she probably thought, oh, he's rather going back, got a call, or he's going to stop and ask me something.
Yeah, she was probably expecting a friendly hello.
Yes.
Instead, Gabe shot her from the car as he pulled up alongside of her.
This is so terrible.
Well, it's just so random now.
It is. And he had a whole evening to sleep this off and wake up and realize what he's done and make a different choice. Even if he had snapped the night before, I feel like, is consciously choosing this now.
Yeah, he's had time to calm down. Whether he slept or not, he had time to calm down and rest.
Yes, hours.
Mm-hmm. But instead, it sounds like he just worked himself up even more. Lillian had been walking by her friend's house when she was shot. Marianne J. was in her sewing room that overlooked the road when she heard the gunshot. She watched Gabe turn the cruiser around and slowly drive away. It was then that she saw her friend and her recognizable token orange vest that she walked in on the road.
Goodness.
She ran to her friend and found her dead. She called 911 and the operator had a hard time understanding that the supposed officer had driven away calmly from what was a crime scene.
No, the officer caused the crime scene.
Yeah, but you can hear from their 911 call that she is clearly not understanding the situation because they hadn't been alerted that there was a shooter driving a cop car.
Yes. So she would think this lady's out to lunch.
That's right.
Excuse me, ma'am. Have you been drinking this morning?
Yeah. It's just so sad.
Oh.
The dispatcher did tell Marianne to take shelter in her home because they didn't know where the shooter was, but Marianne refused to leave her friend's side.
Aw.
Lillian's husband actually would happen upon the scene later when he was out looking for his wife.
Goodness.
Like, they didn't go and tell him. They knew who she was, and they didn't go and notify him.
What is going on? No wonder there was a huge inquest into this case.
Multiple 911 calls would come in from the fire happening along Hunter Road and Lillian's death, and this alerted the police that Gabe was no longer in Portapique. They put it all together. Next, he traveled 21 kilometers to Glenholm. On the way there, he passed another RCMP officer responding to Lillian's murder. At about 9:47 a.m., Corporal Peterson, traveling about 130 kilometers past Gabe, who was traveling much slower and in the opposite direction. He thought immediately that this was a little bit odd, but he had actually been unable to open up the BOLO or the Be on the Lookout report because the tech in his car failed. And so he had been under the impression from previous reports that the car that they were looking for had once had decals on it, and traces of those decals could be seen, but that it was not a fully marked car. And what had passed him was a fully marked car.
So he believed it was legit.
Yeah. So he calls into the station and he confirms that, okay, is the car a fully marked car that we're looking for? Like, what actually does this car look like? Unfortunately, by the time that all of that was sorted out and he had turned around to go back after them, Gabe's car was long gone.
Oh, it's so unfortunate how that played out.
Yeah. Gabe had disappeared by turning into the driveway of Adam and Carol Fisher. The two were aware of what had happened in Portapique the night before. And Adam, who knew Gabe because he had done some excavating work at his property in the past, had just gotten off the phone with the tip line because when he was working for Gabe, he had seen the replica police car. And so he wanted to warn the police about it. Gabe's picture had been posted on social media, but significant details about his movements were not. And the information about the police car was barely released to the police, let alone the public. And so Adam was adamant that they know that he had this police car that looked exactly like a police car. He was trying to be a good citizen.
Yeah, he had put it together.
Yeah. Little did he know, Gabe was right down the road when he made that call. 12 minutes after talking to the police, Gabe pulled into the Fisher's driveway. Because they had been alerted to the threat, they hid.
But does that save their lives?
It does. Both hid in separate rooms and both called 911 while Gabe was walking around the outside of their house.
Oh, that would be so scary.
Yeah. When Gabe couldn't find them, he left the driveway around 9:51 a.m. It was the first time that police had a handle on where Gabe actually was.
Because someone had actually survived to notify the police.
But it actually didn't help them right away. As Gabe left the Fisher's home, he traveled northwest along Plains Road and came upon 33-year-old Kristen Beaton, a nurse that was pregnant. Shortly before 10, she had pulled over to the side of the road to chart between her home care clients. This one really hit me so hard because I have done this so many times. To chart in between clients, you just pull off to the side of the road. When Gabe saw the car, he slowed down and turned into the little pullout that she had turned into. He pulled up alongside Kristen's driver's side window and shot her through it.
My goodness.
He didn't even know her.
No rhyme or reason.
Nope.
She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
That's right.
He's legitimately on a frenzy now.
He has lost it. He didn't know Heather O'Byrne either. She was also a nurse, but she wasn't working that Sunday morning. But she recognized the common charting spot and spotted Kristen's car parked alongside the RCMP car. She thought she heard a gunshot, so she pulled over to the side of the road about 260 meters up from where Kristen's car was, on the south shoulder of the Plains Road. So she went by and she was worried that something was happening. That's why the cop had stopped. Not knowing the supposed cop was the one doing the shooting. As she's pulling over to the side of the road in front of them, Gabe pulled up his car to hers and fatally shot the 55-year-old grandmother through her driver's side window as well. She hadn't even been able to put the car in park. Yeah. As he fled, her car rolled another 60 meters into a wooded ditch. Heather had known that there was an active shooter. She had been on the phone talking to her friend back and forth the whole time. But what she hadn't known was that he was dressed like a police officer. It is believed that she died almost instantaneously. There was some suggestion that she hadn't, but there was an error in the way that her Fitbit had reported her heartbeat. But you can see how this lack of information sharing is leading to so many more deaths. And it's so sad because all of these people are stopping to help.
And how many of them could have been prevented had this information been shared much, much earlier?
Mm-hmm. Had they known that it was a man impersonating a police officer. But that too comes with its own issues. As word spread about Gabe being dressed like a police officer, emotions were heightened even further, and fear truly set in, because now you can't tell the good guys from the bad guys.
Yeah, because they're supposed to be the good guys that you can rely on.
Right. But it was even the police that were fearful, because now they can't tell who's who. In the chaos of it all, officers are accusing other officers of being suspects because, remember, they've pulled in now officers from a lot of different communities and they don't all know each other. They're coming from all over the province. So it wasn't like they were the same people that you were used to seeing, right, or even the exact same cruisers. So if their cruiser's a little bit different than yours and you don't recognize them, you don't know who to trust. There were a couple of very intense moments created when real RCMP officers challenged other real RCMP officers. Shortly after 10:17 a.m., 2 constables approached the Onslow Belmont Fire Brigade Hall. They saw David Westlake, an emergency management officer wearing an orange reflective vest and standing next to an RCMP cruiser. Because they had just received reports that Gabe was wearing an orange vest, they mistook David to be Gabe.
Oh no.
They had also just gotten reports that a cruiser had been spotted in the area with the distinctive push bar that Gabe's car had. Both constables drew their weapons and in heightened emotions fired 5 times towards the fire hall.
They shot first, didn't ask questions.
Well, they did kind of ask questions, but it was all in the same moments. Dave ran into the fire hall yelling, "Shots fired, get down, get down." And 3 other people were in the building. A fire chief, a deputy fire chief, and poor Richard Ellison, Corey's father.
Oh.
The fire hall had been set up to be used as a comfort center, and so they had brought him there because he was so distressed. The 4 men took cover at the back corner of the fire hall behind overturned tables.
They probably thought these other officers were Gabe.
Yeah.
And maybe now an accomplice.
Mm-hmm. The officer that had been standing beside David stayed in his cruiser while the shots were being fired. He used his police radio to identify himself and the number on his police cruiser. He called out, "You guys are pointing your guns at me." And then he called out the code phrase that's used to signal when an officer is pointing his gun or shooting at another officer. This code phrase was obviously redacted from all of the paperwork.
I didn't even think about them having some kind of secret code. How fantastic.
Well, in this situation, it was needed.
Yeah.
But emotions and tensions were just so high. And how could they not be? By 10 a.m. on April 19th, 19 people had died. Bolos now contained information that Gabe was in a fully marked cruiser, and police had all been told to wear their body armor at all times and expect confrontations. So their adrenaline is just running on the highest level possible. And Gabe actually had been the one spotted driving past the fire hall. It had been an accurate report. He had driven past it. After a brief stop to change up his uniform a little bit, Gabe continued south on Highway 2, where he passed Constable Morrison, who was positioned north of the Shubenacadie Cloverleaf. You know what a cloverleaf is, right?
No, what is it?
That's the on-ramps to a highway.
That's called a cloverleaf?
Yes, and if you look at them from the top, then they can form a cloverleaf.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
There's 4 on-ramps and off-ramps for each direction.
Yeah.
So it looks like a cloverleaf.
Like a 4-leaf clover.
Yes. And so that's what he's sitting on, watching traffic pass.
Okay, that makes sense.
He was being vigilant until another officer close by radioed in that they were in the area, so he let down his guard. He shouldn't have. Gabe pulled up next to him and pointed a handgun out the driver's side window. He had thought that it was this other officer coming up to him.
Uh-huh.
He was shot 3 times. His quick reactions and the warning to wear his bulletproof vest saved his life.
Oh, good.
As the gun was fired, Constable Morrison hit the gas and he said, quote, "Glass was breaking and I was hearing things go off and I felt something hit my chest. I felt like things were in my arms. I knew I had a gash on my head, but he just floored it." he hit the guardrail a couple of times trying to get away as he was like ducking under.
That's incredible.
Yeah. He activated the emergency request button, letting them know that he had been shot and his position. So now again, people know where Gabe is. This constable's fight to get help for his own injuries was so chaotic to learn about. No one wanted to approach him later because he was a police officer.
But he was injured.
Yeah, but nobody knew who he was.
Oh, well, and you can't blame them for being terrified of an officer.
Absolutely not. So at the same time, it was really horrible that they didn't let everybody know that Gabe was dressed up like an officer. There were consequences for everybody knowing that he was dressed up like an officer.
It was like they were between a rock and a hard place. Because before that, neighbors were coming out to help and they were getting killed for it.
Yeah.
It is so wild to me how it seems that time after time, things are just moving in Gabe's favor.
Oh, and it actually continues. It's so scary.
And I just wonder how he was feeling because he was such an addict to power and now he had power over the whole area. He was the cause of this chaos.
Well, I think his attitude of invincibility is pretty evident in what he does next. Because as this constable escaped and sought medical assistance, 49-year-old acting corporal Heidi Stevenson was accelerating up the eastern ramp of the Cloverleaf. She had gotten word that this is where the sighting was. Gabe saw her coming, crossed into oncoming traffic, and hit her head on.
What?
Yes.
Endangering himself.
Yeah, but I think that just speaks to how invincible he was feeling at this time.
Totally.
The head-on collision occurred at 10:49. At some point after this collision, Heidi Stevenson exited her vehicle from the driver's door and came to be on the ground. There were conflicting witnesses' accounts about whether this was done under her own power or if Gabe had actually pulled her out of the vehicle. Shots were exchanged between the two before and after she exited the vehicle. During this time, Heidi activated her radio 4 different times in 3 minutes. During the middle 2 activations, there are gunshot sounds, but there's no communication coming from Heidi. On the first and the last activation, no audio was transmitted, so she was just hitting the button. Gabe shot at this heroic officer until she fled her vehicle and was on the ground, and then he approached her and shot her another time at close range.
Oh.
He took her gun and ammunition, but not her radio. At 10:52, Joey Weber, 36, was just driving up onto the Cloverleaf and saw the 2 crashed police vehicles. He was aware of the shooting going on at Portapique, and he and his wife had been discussing it and how it was some distance away from them. So it was like, oh, isn't it how awful how that all is happening way over there? Joey was a country boy that believed in being there for people when they needed someone. He pulled up his 2008 Ford Escape to the scene. When he got out, probably before he could even register what was happening, Gabe had forced him into the back seat of the replica cruiser and shot him.
Put him in the cruiser? That is just bizarre.
Yep. Gabe then set both cars on fire and fled in Joe's SUV, paying no attention to his own head wound, where Heidi's bullets had grazed him.
His poor wife to later find out that he became a victim when they were just talking about it that day.
Yeah, something so far away.
Right.
So sad.
Which is rural life mentality too. When we think about our neighboring towns, oh, that's far away. We're fine.
Yeah. It happened somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, this was happening all in their backyards. As Gabe fled down the highway, he must have recognized a colleague's home about 1.8 kilometers from the Cloverleaf. He made a U-turn and parked the SUV in 54-year-old Gina Gallette's driveway. He parked around back so the SUV wasn't visible from the road. Gina was a free-spirited lover of life. She had been a denturist for 27 years and had associations with Gabe in his past. Gabe broke into her house through the side door. He shot one of her dogs and then found Gina hiding in her ensuite bathroom, where he fatally shot her.
My goodness.
That morning, Gina had expressed concern to her daughter that Gabe knew where she lived.
Really?
Because his name was being announced all over the news.
But that just speaks to what kind of character she thought he was if she was fearing for her life.
Gabe walked out of the house with the keys of her Mazda 3. In their place, he left behind numerous clothing articles and a partially filled gas tank. It took him all of 5 to 10 minutes to end another person's life and ruin another family. When he got into the vehicle, the gas light was on, so he had to drive to Emersdale, Petro-Canada at 11:17.
What? He stops and gets gas?
He tries. Almost at that exact same time, 3 constables enter the same gas station, all dressed in full tactical gear.
Finally, something is working against him in this universe.
Well, hold that thought.
Oh.
They were separated by the pump divider, and they don't see each other and are really unaware of each other's activities. I believe when Gabe went around to switch pumps, because the first one that he came to didn't work, he went around to switch the pumps. That's when he became aware of these police officers. Because he doesn't get out of the car. He leaves without getting gas. The police officers at the time were looking for a police car.
Oh, no.
And they hadn't been tipped off that Gabe was now no longer in a police car, and he was now no longer wearing a bright orange vest or distinguishable police uniform. So they didn't clue in that it was him.
They'd have no reason to.
Well, his face was plastered everywhere. He had a cut on the side of his head, but all of them admit that they didn't pay close attention to his facial features because now everybody's focused on the cop car, which he doesn't have anymore.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I was so excited thinking this is where he was going to get caught.
During this time, multiple news reports are going out, spreading the word that Gabe is roaming rural Nova Scotia. People are starting to call in cop cars everywhere.
Because all the cop cars are out looking.
That's right. And so it created this mass confusion as police are now trying to figure out which cop cars are where, which sightings are real.
What a nightmare.
Yeah. Gabe, though, still needs gas, so he pulls into Enfield Big Stop, parking at Pump 5 at 11:24. And he just sits there. It looks like he's debating on taking the guns out with him. There are several times that he kind of reaches across the passenger seat and then he goes back and forth. And I wonder at this time if he was starting to get a little tired or if his head wound was actually starting to get to him. Or maybe it was just the head-on collision, because it looks like he's hesitant, that he doesn't really know what to do next. At this gas station, again, police officers pull in at pretty much the same time in an unmarked RCMP SUV unit. Because they've been all out looking for him too, so they have to refill, and this was a fairly big gas station on a busy highway.
What are the chances, though? 2 gas stations in a row that he's going to encounter police officers.
Right, just crazy. Police service dog member Constable Craig Hubley, traveling with emergency response team member Constable Ben McLeod, had been working the case all night. Constable McLeod was involved in the extraction of Lisa Banfield in Portapique. Her terror was scarred into his brain.
Oh, I believe it.
Constable Hubley had extracted the Blair's family dog from Portapique. He had insisted that every effort be made to save this dog because he recognized how important it would be to those children because they had lost both their parents.
My goodness. And you would just be clinging to the hope of something turning out right because you would feel so helpless.
Yeah. Their trauma was scarred into his brain. Both officers had also been at the scenes in Glenholm and at Kristen's car. They were using Constable Hubley's scent dog to track, and Constable McLeod was providing cover for Constable Hubley while he worked the dog. Both of these officers had Gabe's face burned into their brain. So when they saw the man acting strange and just sitting at the pumps, they immediately recognized him. They didn't need the police car. They didn't need the bright orange vest.
Good.
They watched as Gabe raised Acting Constable Stevenson's service pistol that he had stolen from her, and they began to shoot. Both Constable Hubley and Constable McLeod testified that they, quote, followed their training, shooting multiple rounds in a short period of time to ensure the threat presented by the perpetrator was addressed. Video surveillance would later show that at the same time that the police were shooting at his car, the dirtbag shot himself. An autopsy would later say that the head wounds he had sustained from Heidi's gun were not the fatal injuries. At 11:25, Constable McLeod broadcasts that shots were away, and at 11:31, additional officers opened the door to find Gabe dead. And it was just all over like that. He was dead. In 13 hours, in roughly 195 kilometers, and 16 different crime scenes, 22 people were dead, not counting Kristen's unborn child. In his will, dated March 29, 2011, Gabe had requested that upon his death, that his body be wrapped in a Hudson Bay blanket and buried in a concrete vault at the cemetery in Portapique with no service, obituary, or public notice of his death. Instead, everyone knew and celebrated when he died.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Mm-hmm. But justice didn't seem fulfilled. His death didn't answer any of the questions people had. Why had he targeted certain people? Had it all been random? The inquest was able to find some previous connections to the original people that he shot. Lisa felt like it was because he had been looking for her. But then it had become all about the wrong time and the wrong place, and the dirtbag continued his rampage.
And I don't think that it was because there was no reports that he was hollering for her, asking, "Where's my wife? Give her to me."
No, there wasn't. Unfortunately, the only one that could confirm or deny any of these theories or thoughts, these ideas, took the answers to his grave.
And it just feels unjustified because he's not held responsible.
That's right. And how do you pick up the pieces after something like this? The recovery of the victims' families and the communities was compounded not only because of the scale of this tragedy that had happened, but because it was in the middle of the COVID pandemic. People were not allowed to gather or comfort each other. The pain and suffering was endured, for most on an isolated road, by each individual family or cohort. It was a huge tragedy. But maritime spirit did prevail. As the communities in Nova Scotia healed, they did not let this dirtbag's actions hamper their spirit of togetherness. Almost immediately following the shooting, red hearts started to appear all over, on mailboxes and windows, on front lawns, in private homes, and in businesses. And not just in the communities directly affected, everywhere. The hearts were all different, but they conveyed the same message, that they were still going to support one another.
That's really beautiful, because they could have taken this as a way to isolate themselves and just be leery instead of just coming together in love.
Mm-hmm. They could have used all of those people dying while they were trying to help as an excuse not to help.
Right. It's truly remarkable.
It is. And that is the case of the coercive, conniving, and obsessive dirtbag, Gabriel Wortman.
Good riddance.
So done with that dirtbag.
Oh.
This was a case that I actively followed while it was happening, and still I did not appreciate the significance of catching someone that was impersonating a police officer.
No, the police didn't even capture that,
No.
the significance of it. And I really feel like this case could be used in training other officers and just how things are handled.
Oh, it definitely is being used in training. It's something good that will come of this.
I know that was 2020, but that really wasn't that long ago. So our hearts really go out to the people and the residents of Nova Scotia. We hope that you're healing. And thank you to the listeners who requested we cover this case.
And for all of those ones that requested any of the cases. We love hearing from you. And if we didn't cover your case, keep listening. You might hear it in the future, because Christy's going to be back with us next week.
Not with a listener request, but with another case.
Until then,
See ya.
bye. I'm not going to have any bloopers for this one, Christy.
We'll just be us crying.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't get emotional, crying sad. It was more like, oh my goodness, how could this happen? And why did they mess up? And why didn't they do this? It was anger.
Like pit in our stomach at the end.
Yeah. The abuse. There's my blooper.
Abuse.
Abuse. The abuse.
Did we go see the Batman Lego movie together?
Pew, pew, pew.
No, I still laugh about that sometimes. Pew, 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 pew. That was like the most clever thing ever for that movie.
That is a great movie. I like that one.
It is.
Marriage and parenthood. Why was I worried about bloopers?
Well, parenthood does start in the pants, Melissa.
Yeah, it does. Marriage and parenthood. No, I can't even say it without laughing.
It's the wrong kind of hood.
On the 19th of March.
May 19th of March.
Yeah. Just like many small communities. I don't know why I'm emotional, Christy.
You said you weren't going to cry.
COVID quit.
COVID quid. Are you talking about like a field of clover?
No.
Oh, then maybe I don't.
What? You don't know what a clover leaf is? around rural North Dakota. How do I even make this stuff up? Like, have I even said North Dakota at all?
Not even someone's had the name Dakota.
I know.
Nothing. We're not even in the U.S.
No. So weird, right? That makes sense.
Yep.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.